DIGGANOBZ. As you allow your eyes to pass over this mildly schizophrenic piece of artwork, I imagine many questions like, why are the humans in green face? And is that weird boy wannabe wearing a circuitry board as a cuirass? Well, these questions and more will be answered today as we talk about the DIGGANOBZ, or the Diggaz as the orks somewhat derogatorily refer to them as, although the word digger feels a pinch dangerous on YouTube in 2023, if I'm to be entirely honest. Anywho, the DIGGANOBZ are a human population on the world of Angelis, a world with a bit of a tumultuous backstory, you see, that has undergone some rather trying periods of history. One of which is the reason for the human population in the first place, as the world of Angelis was first discovered by Adeptus Mechanicus explorator vessels, who were quite puzzled by this weird little world. You see, the world was completely devoid of life. Anything and everything. Zip, nilch, null, nada. And we're not merely talking about the absence of bunnies and cows or creepy-ass humanoids going bump in the night. We're talking about the absence of everything, even bacteria or single-cell life forms. Nothing that could be defined as living existed on the planet of Angelis. Now, that in and of itself wasn't actually all that unusual. The vast majority of space is, well, dead, empty space, with the occasional hunk of frozen mud and or rock hurtling through it. What made Angelis so worthy of note was that it should have been supporting a flourishing biosphere, as all of the requirements and usual indicators were present and plentiful, leading the Adeptus Mechanicus explorator crew to come to one inescapable conclusion, as it seemed literally statistically impossible that the planet had never evolved any sort of life. The only logical explanation would be that something eradicated it all. Which of course leads to a whole heaping heck of a lot of different and far more interesting questions to people with a fetish for technology. Namely, what exactly could have wiped out every speck of life on an entire planet down to the molecular level without leaving any traces of its deployment behind whatsoever? There was no radiation, there were no signs of flesh-eating bacteria or other toxic elements in the atmosphere. All life simply seemed to have just disappeared at some point. And to make matters even stranger, there were signs of an advanced civilization on the planet's surface, as all the way from space, the Mechanicus explorator vessels were able to map out the locations of several enormous pyramids. Oh. I suspect most of you already know where this one's going, but the Mechanicus explorators had no goddamn clue. So, having tested the atmosphere and found it to be breathable, they deposited huge quantities of laborers, tech adepts, and other specialists down onto the planet's surface to begin the investigation into these mysterious monolithical structures. And clearly the pyramids must have tickled their inquisitive pickles quite a bit, because a lot of people were shuttled down to the planet's surface. Adepts, laborers, and all manners of dudes built what must have been entire settlements down there, building long and girthy tunnels beneath the pyramids, trying to figure out how they were built, how deep they went, and what sort of material they were constructed from, as clearly they had no way of accessing the pyramids directly. If they did, they probably simply would have blown them up, wandered inside and had a look around, or scanned them or brought back samples, but none of this appears to have happened, as they apparently set up for a long-term occupation of the site. These optimistic plans, however, were interrupted by a warp signature emerging on the outer edges of the system. This, too, in and of itself, wasn't necessarily anything to be worried about. It could be a starship from the Imperium. It could be yet further exploratory elements. It could be Imperial Navy patrols. Worst case scenario, maybe it was pirates or some other ruffians. No need to fear, however. Exploratory vessels are heavily armed and armored, and no matter what emerged from the warp, they could surely deal with it. Unless, of course, it was the worst case scenario, which is precisely what it was, as the hole in reality grew larger and larger and larger as a truly titanic spacecraft pushed its way through and into reality, tearing a jagged hole in space and time, which collapsed in upon itself, resulting in a localized warp storm surrounding the planet. Angelus's second visitor, in God Emperor alone knows how many millennia, was a space Hulk. And a truly vast one at that. What happened next is a bit unclear. Perhaps the Adeptus Mechanicus explorator vessel tried desperately to escape the system, risking everything to dive into the tumultuous reaches of the warp, hoping to emerge unscathed somewhere else. If they did not succeed, as the only further mention of the Imperial exploration elements to Angelus is that no further contact was ever acquired. Maybe, having read the trajectory of the Space Hulk, heading directly for the planet, the ship broke orbit in an attempt to destroy it, or to force it to change course, or to blow it off course with simple weapons fire. It, too, did not work, as even an explorator vessel was like a gnat before an elephant, and failed in the attempt. Maybe the ship was caught in the gravitic field of the spaceship and dragged down to the surface alongside it. Maybe it was destroyed by weapons still functioning on the Space Hulk. Maybe in a desperate attempt it tried to ram it or get in its way. Regardless, the Space Hulk continued on its merry plunging path straight into the planet, where its millions of tons of steel carved a long rent in the world, which would become known to the new populace of the planet as the Skid. For the Hulk, you see, was occupied by orks. Hundreds of thousands and maybe millions of greenskins which inhabited this enormous free-reign ticket to the warp, hoping that it would bring them to war and bloodshed, to the WAAAAAAAAAGH, as their prophets had promised. But as the handful of scattered, bleeding survivors dug their way out of the kilometers of hull, they emerged on what was already a dead planet. Bad luck. For the humans, however, bad luck was about to get a hell of a lot worse. The explorator vessel had broken orbit so quickly that it had been unable to evacuate all of the Imperial servants still on the planet down below. And as fate and providence would have it, the Space Hulk impacted relatively nearby, causing massive destruction to the extensive tunnel networks that the explorators had dug underneath the pyramids. The enormous tectonic strain and the subsequent reverberations sent throughout the planet's crust saw the tunnels begin to shift and collapse, burying the survivors in darkness. This period of the Diggaz' history is referred to now by the somewhat more lowbrow descendants of the original explorator crew simply as the Darkness, as the various groupings began to fight over what little and scarce resources still existed. Apparently, the explorator vessels had deposited quite a bit of logistical support systems down onto the planet, including machines that could produce food and water from thin air. Miraculous things that quickly became desirable objects, causing the various splinter factions to determine that they should have access to these things, and preferably nobody else. As they say, civilization is ever 3 meals away from anarchy, and apparently, that also counts for when the 3 last meals haven't yet been eaten. This next period became known as the First Pre-Digger War, where the survivors established themselves into tribes, laying claim to certain stretches of tunnels and areas as their own. Over then, hundreds of years, they developed a full-on flourishing society deep beneath the ground. Or, well, flourishing is probably stretching it a wee bit, but their numbers did grow, and with ever-increasing numbers came the ever-increasing need for more space and more resources, which could, in their extraordinarily limited ecosphere, only be acquired by taking it from somebody else, leading to the Second Pre-Digger War, which yet again caused society to splinter and spread out yet further with the creation of new tribes and societies. At this point as well, in all due likelihood, they would have started digging into the surrounding area, whichever area was soft enough to be dug in, that is, of course, as clearly they did not have the technology to extract themselves from their buried state, meaning that they didn't have the tech to dig directly up. Either they didn't have the resources, the knowledge on how to properly brace the shafts, or the technological machinery to actually do the digging. But surely, some expansion must have been possible with good old-fashioned shovels and pickaxes. This period of instability would eventually be interrupted by one of beneficent stability, enforced by good old-fashioned military might. Or, well, actually, monsters would be the more correct term, as one of the countless new tribes, which called itself the Wreckers, wandered into the deeper reaches of the tunnels. These stretches of corridors were generally avoided by the populace because, well, they were goddamn scary, and something lived down there, and whatever it was, it seemed to have developed quite the taste for human, as very few who ever ventured into its twisting depths emerged, and even fewer emerged with their sanity intact. Everybody simply wrote the Wreckers off as another lunatic band that met a horrific end down deep below the earth. But one day, they reappeared with demands. They asked the other tribes to submit or be exterminated. The tribes, of course, found this rather funny. What could the scraggly remnants of a long-lost tribe do to them? Well, as it turned out, they could sick their new Necron pets on them. Yes, somehow. The humans had wandered down into the tunnels, discovered huge subterranean chambers filled with Necron warriors laid in stasis, and they had convinced the Necrons to join them. Okay. Now, bearing in mind, this is a supplement from 1998. And so the whole idea of the Necrons and their lore and their society and etc. wasn't really fully established yet, shall we say. Now, clearly, GW had some idea as to who the Necrons were or what they were intended to be fairly early on, as we have very old mentions of Necrons referred to simply as, like, robotic warriors and so on. So it is entirely possible that they figured, like, okay, well, we've got these alien Xenos thingity-bobs, and they're buried on this planet, and they were totally like an ancient civilization and stuff, but maybe they could get along with peoples. And they described, of course, the compact in no real actual details, like they made some horrific sacrifice or deal or yada 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 to get them to work alongside them. And I could see them doing it. You know, they arrive down there, find the local head honcho, and as he's about to suck their fear and soul out through their nostrils, they go, hold on. there's a lot more where we came from, and if you give us some time, say a few thousand years, maybe a blink of an eye to a Necron, we can make sure that there will be even more of us. Would you really like to eat me and my 12 retarded buddies who waffle down here like the idiots we are? Or would you like to have a nice, big, fat, satisfying meal a little bit later? I can see it. Regardless of what happened, the Wreckers re-emerged and quickly established absolute dominance of the remaining tribes, as, well, a bunch of, at this point, pre-technology savages with sticks and stones weren't really much of a match for the Necrontyr legions, as it turned out. Now reunited in glorious, unified harmony, the Wreckers declared that it was time to head for the surface. The mysterious, now at this point surely near mythical overworld. As at this point apparently over 100 generations have passed. Now, generation is a loose term that often refers to a period of 10 to 20 odd years, etc. So if it truly was 100 generation, it has been a while. But considering the tribes were large enough to have been living down here for a very long time, and to the point where there is enough of them to engage in open warfare with the orcs, or at least to a degree on the surface, they must have been down there for quite some stretch of time. That was about to end, however, as the Wreckers told them to head up, up, up and above. It was one hell of a slag and a slog and a nightmare, as tunnel after tunnel collapsed, after workgang after workgang died in repeated accidents. But slowly and surely, one swing of a pickaxe and a thrust of a shovel at a time, they got closer and closer to the surface. As they began to emerge near the crust, they heard strange, unknown noises from above, rumblings, shivers and quivers in the rocks, and what sounded like loud growls or roars. This freaked out the savages, unsurprisingly, but their overlords told them to continue, until finally they arrived in a large open crater, where they could see the sun above for the first time in countless generations, and also huge mechanical monsters shoveling dirt out of the way, as apparently the orcs, now also having spread across the planet looking for bits and pieces with which to rebuild their spaceship, had discovered the Diggaz and the pyramids and had also figured, well, this looks technological, let's excavate it. Now, one might expect that violence would occur immediately, but the strange, scraggly-ass, dirty, blinking in the lights humans weren't really recognized by the orcs as much of a threat. They observed the bemused and frightened little creatures awing and oohing and gaping at their trucks and buggies as diggers, or burrowing creatures. Animals, essentially. Now, orcs are of course orcs, and whilst they did not immediately launch into a genocidal rampage, primarily due to the lack of any actual challenge in genociding this particular species, they did set about enslaving the diggers. Yet again, I feel YouTube algorithms constricting around my neck. But as they began enslaving the populace, they dug deeper, discovering further tribes, and eventually they ran into the Wreckers. Now, the Wreckers had no real way to resist the orc invasion, as all they had in terms of weaponry were, well, again, sticks, stones, shovels, and pickaxes. Firearms and energy weapons and anything else of the sort had long since been forgotten, but, of course, they still possessed their glow-in-the-dark pets. And they were soon to be unleashed on the brutish invaders. The ensuing slaughter would have near uniquely few survivors on the green-skinned side of things, and would cause the orcs to name the area around the pyramids as the place of death, horror, and darkness from which you will not return alive. That's a pretty strident warning there by orc standards. And something they found to be rather unfortunate as well, because the pyramids were indeed laced with all kinds of old-school technology that the orcs wanted. There are a whole lot of it buried beneath the ruins as well, not to mention the various scrap that the digganobs had long since rejected as pointless thingamabobs of no real usage were really pieces of old imperial technology, stuff that the orcs were very interested in getting their little paws on. Unfortunately, with the glowy-eyed pets around, there was no way to actually take the tech directly from the diggers. And so, hesitantly, the orcs had to interact with the diggers in a non-genocidal manner. A little-known orcish ritual called trade. And the diggers themselves were all too happy to participate, as, again, they didn't really have any real understanding of the bits and pieces they were picking up, and so being given orcish technology was, well, to them, space-age tech. I mean, it's not wrong, the orcs do create spacecraft, it's just, you know, it's just not quite what you would normally imagine. But nevertheless, things like firearms and bikes and trucks and even the occasional piece of powered armor, etc., all of this was incredibly valuable to the diggers. And the pieces of scrap and technology were equally valuable to the orcs. And since, again, the orcs couldn't conduct trade via the other form of diplomacy, this was their best option. But since there was only so much scrap immediately available, the diggers themselves, hungering ever more for orcish technology, needed to start spreading out in the desert around their pyramids to look for more scrap. And thus, the Digganob warbands were created. Their objectives were essentially exactly the same as the orcish mobs. Go out into the wilderness, find something big, shiny, and preferably hard, and then exchange it for currency, weapons, vehicles, horned helmets, whatever their fancy might desire at the time. And as it turned out, with the orcs being the most technologically advanced race on this particular planet, except for their Necrons, I suppose, the diggers started to imitate and mimic orcish behavior. They started to speak like them. They started to adapt their aesthetics. They started painting themselves green to more resemble their idolized orcish counterparts. They started using, of course, their weapons and their vehicles, and developing an appreciation for the finer things in orcish life. For example, not having had anything resembling a true currency before, the diggers now started using teeth, just like the orcs. Orc teeth, mind you, because, well, human teeth, although they are, well, teeth, they don't quite carry the same value as a good old-fashioned proper orcish tooth, of course. The greenskins, on the other hand, are amused at best and only slightly insulted at worst by the diggers' apparent aping of their aesthetics, style, and culture. They value their trade and their ability to give them shiny bits, even though they do view them as a bit of an inferior species, or more correctly, they view them as a bit daft, a bit brain damaged, frankly. As in good old-fashioned orc logic, of course, well, they are diggers. So they can't be orcs, because only orcs can be orcs. And therefore you can't possibly have a digger orc, because only orcs can be orcs. And so the circle continues for the foreseeable future. Whereas the diggers try ever harder to mimic orcish behavior. They will, for example, take it upon themselves to oppress any Gretchins, Grots, or Goblins that they discover, for the single, sole, solitary reason that they have seen the orcs also oppress the Gretchins, the Goblins, and etc. It's not much of a reason, but hey, does oppression ever truly need a reason? I think not. And so, the days go past on Angelus, presumably, they still do, as I haven't heard of the planet getting blown up anytime. But, well, like most of these specialty games released around the same period, they get released and then they get forgotten about very, very quickly. There is a Gorkamorka video game on the way. Perhaps we might be so lucky as to see the lovable little DIGGANOBZ featured in it as well. I will say I did play it briefly for a little while myself, and, well, it's got some ideas at least, but the execution is not exactly up to snuff yet. We can still cross our fingers and hope that'll shape up into something a little bit more substantive. But until next time, I have been Arch. Thank you all very much for watching, and I hope to see you all again soon. Till then, have a good day.